Hey there! Tonight we're going to dive deep into one of the toughest and most grueling jobs of the 1600s, being a sailor. Life at sea back then was anything but glamorous. Far from the adventurous tales you might have heard, sailors faced brutal conditions every single day. And discover why these men endured so much and how their struggles shaped the course of maritime life forever. Let's get started. From cramped, filthy quarters to dangerous storms that threatened to sink their ships, their lives were filled with hardship and constant struggle. We'll explore the deadly diet that led to scurvy, the harsh discipline enforced through brutal punishments, and the mental toll of loneliness and fear that weighed heavily on these men. Along the way, we'll uncover the threats of piracy, the dangers of navigating unknown waters, and the harsh realities waiting for sailors even when they finally returned to shore. Whether it was the relentless labor, the ever-present fear of mutiny, or the superstitions that shaped their beliefs, being a sailor in the 1600s was truly one of the worst jobs imaginable. So buckle up as we set sail into history. To understand what life was truly like for a sailor in the 1600s, one must first imagine the space they called home, if it could even be called that. Far from the romantic images of open seas and fresh ocean breezes, the reality was claustrophobic, foul, and relentlessly uncomfortable. The sailors' quarters were located deep in these lower decks, far from the fresh air and sunlight. The space allotted to each man was scarcely larger than a coffin, often no more than a few feet wide and tall enough only to sit upright. The timber beams were perpetually damp, encouraging mold and mildew to bloom on every surface. This dampness not only ruined clothing and bedding, but also fostered an environment where sickness and decay thrived. Men were expected to relieve themselves quickly and return below deck, often while still feeling the oppressive stench and surrounded by the filth of the lower decks. Clothing rarely dried properly and was perpetually damp, smelly, and infested with lice. The limited number of clothes meant that sailors often wore the same garments for weeks on end, further amplifying the stench and discomfort. Waste sometimes accumulated in corners, festering in the damp air and contributing to the overall foulness. Sailors' skin became chapped and raw, and sores and rashes were common. Illness spread rapidly in such close quarters. Respiratory infections, skin diseases, and infestations were rampant. Humor, superstition, and rituals helped pass the long, dark hours. But the fact remained, life below deck in the 1600s was one of the worst imaginable conditions. A daily battle against discomfort, disease, and despair. The physical toll weakened men, reducing their strength and endurance just when the ship demanded their full effort. Morale plummeted, and the constant misery sometimes sparked conflict or even rebellion. Sailors had no private rooms, no personal beds. Instead, they shared narrow hammocks strung close together like rows of hanging fish. The ships were built for cargo and warfare first, with little regard for crew comfort. But for the men of the 1600s, the cramped quarters and filthy conditions were an inescapable reality, a harsh testament to the brutal demands of life at sea. Ventilation was minimal to preserve the hull's strength and watertight integrity. Space was precious and allocated to stores, armaments, and supplies before crew quarters. As a result, sailors' well-being was often sacrificed in favor of the ship's mission. The noise below deck was relentless. The creaking and groaning of the ship's timbers, the pounding of waves, the scraping of ropes, and the occasional shout or curse. The unending darkness and confinement bred despair and claustrophobia. The lack of privacy, combined with the close proximity to others, led to tension and conflict. Sailors were often cramped together for months at a time, with little chance to escape the oppressive environment. Rats scurrying overhead or underfoot disturbed any chance of rest. When storms raged, the ship lurched violently, pitching men from their hammocks and forcing them to cling desperately to the ropes to avoid injury. When the hammocks were not in use, they were folded up during the day to clear room for work and movement. The living quarters of sailors were tiny, overcrowded, and shrouded in darkness and dampness that seeped into bone and spirit alike. With so many men packed below deck, oxygen was quickly consumed, replaced by a pungent mixture of sweat, unwashed bodies, spilled food, and the unmistakable stench of human waste. The ship's ventilation was primitive at best, small grates or scuttles that let in little more than a dim shaft of daylight or a sliver of ocean air. And gnawing on anything soft rope, leather, and even the flesh of sleeping sailors on rare occasions. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs were ubiquitous, biting relentlessly and spreading disease. The cramped quarters made any attempt at cleanliness almost impossible. With no running water and only a few buckets, washing was a luxury seldom afforded, and bathing was often weeks or months apart. This meant the atmosphere was suffocating, heavy with moisture and rot. Below deck, the ship's belly was a maze of narrow passages and cramped compartments stacked with the essentials for sailing, storage, and survival. The air was thick and stale. Moisture was a constant companion. The wooden ship's hull leaked with every wave, and rain, sea spray, and humidity penetrated every crack and crevice. Filth and vermin were among the most relentless horrors. Rats scurried through the compartments in the dead of night. Feeding on leftover scraps sanitation was primitive and degrading. The ship as latrine, if it could be dignified with that name, was little more than a wooden platform or a hole over the side of the ship. Clothing was another source of misery. Made from coarse wool or heavy canvas, sailors' garments were ill-suited for the wet and changing weather. Sleep was fitful and uncomfortable. With hammocks crammed close together, there was little room to move. Beyond the physical discomfort, the psychological weight of these conditions was crushing. Attempts to improve conditions were limited by the realities of seafaring technology and the priorities of shipowners and captains. The consequences of these cramped and filthy quarters were severe. Despite all this, sailors endured. Many formed tight bonds in the shared misery, leaning on each other for support and camaraderie. In later centuries, ships would see improvements, better ventilation, improved sanitation, and more attention to sailors' needs. The life of a 1600 sailor was a constant struggle against the elements, enemies at sea, and the relentless hardships aboard ship. Among these, perhaps the deadliest and most insidious threat was not the storm or the cannonball, but the simple lack of fresh food, the absence of proper nutrition, especially the scarcity of fresh fruits. The ships of the 1600s were designed primarily to carry weapons, trade goods, and dried provisions, salted meat, hardtack biscuits, dried peas, and barrels of fresh water or ale. While these supplies could last weeks or months, they lacked the essential nutrients found in fresh fruits and vegetables. And vegetables led to scurvy, a disease so feared it could decimate entire crews, and chronic starvation that weakened bodies and minds alike. Early signs were often mistaken for mere exhaustion or seasickness, but as the disease progressed, sailors suffered severe muscle weakness, swollen and bleeding gums, and teeth that loosened and fell out. Wounds and bruises appeared spontaneously and failed to heal. Joints became swollen and painful, making movement agonizing. Hardtack was notoriously dry and tasteless, often infested with weevils or mold. Meals were monotonous and unappetizing, consisting mainly of hardtack and salted meat, sometimes supplemented by dried peas or beans. The combination of scurvy and starvation was lethal. One disease, weakening the body's defenses, the other starving it of energy. The mind, too, was affected. Hunger and disease brought despair, confusion, and irritability, leading to tension and sometimes violence aboard ship. Entire crews could be wiped out not by battle or weather, but by the invisible hand of malnutrition and disease. Their endurance in the face of starvation and disease is a testament to human resilience, but it came at a terrible cost. Ships returned to port with men who were mere shadows of their former selves, bodies ravaged by months of neglect and deprivation. Their suffering was often hidden from the world, recorded only in ship logs, medical notes, and the memories of those few who survived. Fresh water was precious, and thirst was a constant torment. Scurvy and starvation were not just diseases. They were grim companions on every voyage, reminding sailors of the ocean's unforgiving nature. Many sailors drank seawater in desperation, which only worsened dehydration. Scurvy victims often appeared gaunt and hollow-eyed, their bodies ravaged from within. Food supplies were often inadequate, not only in nutrition, but also in quantity. It wasn't until centuries later that the importance of vitamin C was discovered, and remedies such as citrus fruits were introduced. However, some early explorers and captains noticed empirical cures, fresh fruits and vegetables, or even beer brewed with certain ingredients could improve health. But these were exceptions rather than the rule. Ships could be stranded at sea for months, waiting for favorable winds or trapped by storms. Food ran low, and hunger gnawed at the crew, sapping energy and will. They were unable to perform the hard labor required to sail the ship, and their suffering was a chilling reminder of the sea's cruelty. Salted meat was greasy and salty, and its preservation method destroyed vital vitamins. Fresh water was rationed strictly, and sometimes replaced with weak beer or watered-down wine, which sailors drank to avoid dehydration and combat the terrible taste of stagnant water. Scurvy, caused by a deficiency of vitamin C, was the bane of long sea voyages. At a time when the understanding of nutrition was rudimentary, sailors had no idea why their bodies deteriorated so rapidly on prolonged journeys. The symptoms began subtly: fatigue, weakness, and aching joints. But soon, the disease tightened its grip with swelling gums, bleeding, tooth loss, and painful sores that refused to heal. Without intervention, scurvy was fatal. The root cause was the inability to store fresh produce on board. The dietary staples, although calorically dense, were woefully insufficient to maintain health. On long voyages, fresh food was a luxury that soon disappeared. The ship's stores were consumed quickly, and after weeks or months at sea, nothing remained but dried and salted rations. Because fresh fruits and vegetables could not be grown or stored easily, they were almost completely absent from the sailor's diet. This absence meant the body's supply of vitamin C dwindled, and scurvy set in. The symptoms of scurvy were horrific and demoralizing. The sight of men with bloated limbs, dark patches on the skin, and gums raw and oozing blood was common. Starvation, closely tied to scurvy, was another relentless enemy. Rations were strictly controlled by officers to stretch supplies as long as possible. As starvation set in, men grew weak, their muscles wasting away. Efforts to combat scurvy were largely unsuccessful in the 1600s due to a lack of understanding. The deadly diet of sailors contributed to some of the highest mortality rates at sea. Despite these hardships, sailors pressed on, driven by duty, desperation, or the hope of better fortunes ashore. In the cold, cramped holds of the ship, where fresh air was scarce and vermin thrived, men battled hunger and scurvy in silence. To be a sailor in the 1600s was to face an enemy that could neither be fought with swords nor outrun with speed, a slow, creeping killer that wore down body and soul with equal cruelty. On the turbulent seas of the 1600s, survival depended not just on the strength of a ship or the skill of its captain, but on the absolute discipline of its crew. The vast oceans were unforgiving, and the fragile wooden vessels that carried men across them required strict order and obedience to avoid disaster. The hierarchy aboard ship was strict, with captains and officers wielding almost absolute power. To maintain order among a motley crew of often unruly men, many of whom were pressed into service against their will, or drawn from society's lower ranks, harsh discipline was deemed essential. Discipline aboard these ships was rigid and unyielding, a necessary evil enforced through harsh and often brutal punishments. The punishment was not just about maintaining control. It was a tool to instill fear, obedience, and respect in a world where one slip could mean the loss of a ship and lives. It was reserved for the most egregious offenses, often mutiny or serious breaches of discipline. Stories of keel hauling struck terror into sailors' hearts, reinforcing the extreme risks of defying command. For sailors, life on a 1600 ship was as much about enduring the relentless authority of their superiors as it was about battling the sea. Confined sailors suffered not only physical discomfort, but also psychological torment from isolation. These included the bilboes' iron shackles fastened to a sailor's ankles, or the infamous wooden collar, which forced a man's head and neck into an uncomfortable position, restricting movement and making sleep nearly impossible. Such devices were meant to shame and break a sailor's spirit. A sailor sentenced to flogging would be stripped bare to the waist, tied to the ship's mast or a wooden frame. Sailors lived in constant fear of pain and humiliation, which added to the already brutal conditions aboard ship. The fear of flogging or keel hauling enforced cooperation and obedience, but it also bred resentment and fear of officers. Many suffered injuries that never fully healed, and the mental scars could last a lifetime. When sailors felt pushed beyond endurance by punishment and deprivation, rebellion became a last resort. The consequences of mutiny were even more severe, often punishable by death, but the risk was sometimes worth taking to escape unbearable conditions. Offenders might be forced to stand on the catwalk, a narrow platform above the waterline, while the crew jeered or threw rotten food and refuse. In some cases, sailors were put in the stocks or pillory, exposed to the elements and the scorn of their comrades. But the threat of harsh punishment was always present, a shadow hanging over every sailor's shoulder. And whipped with a cat o' nine tails, a whip made of 9 knotted cords designed to tear flesh. The number of lashes could be staggering, sometimes reaching into the hundreds for serious offenses. They shaped daily existence, enforced the rigid social order aboard ship, and served as grim reminders of the ocean's dangers beyond the natural elements. The lash, the chains, and the threat of death kept sailors in line. But they also bore witness to the harsh realities of a world where survival depended on order as much as on skill or courage. Failing to obey orders, neglecting duties, drunkenness, fighting among the crew, insubordination, desertion attempts, and theft were all punishable offenses. The captain's word was law, and the line between discipline and cruelty was often blurred. Disobedience, negligence, or even minor infractions could result in severe consequences. This disparity fueled resentment and sometimes led to tension and unrest. A sailor who refused to climb the rigging in a storm or ignored commands could jeopardize the entire ship and crew. Maintaining order through fear was seen as necessary to keep the vessel afloat and on course. The flogged sailor was left raw and vulnerable, sometimes unable to work for days or weeks afterward. Flogging was public and designed as a spectacle to warn others, heightening the fear of punishment and reinforcing authority. One of the most dreaded punishments was flogging, a brutal form of whipping that was both a physical and psychological torment. This cruel method involved dragging a sailor under the ship's keel, the central structural beam, running along the bottom of the hull, often tied to a rope. The sailor would be thrown overboard on one side, dragged beneath the ship's rough wooden bottom, scraped by barnacles and sharp edges, and pulled up on the other side. The pain was excruciating and often left the victim with deep cuts, bruises, and scars. Another horrific punishment, though less commonly used, was keel hauling. Keel hauling was almost always fatal or caused severe injuries such as broken bones, deep lacerations, and drowning. In addition to flogging and keel hauling, punishments included confinement in the ship's brig, a small, dark, and cramped prison cell, or being put in chains or iron shackles. Other punishments were designed to humiliate rather than injure. Public humiliation was a tool to maintain order. The reasons for punishment were numerous and varied. Discipline was not applied evenly. Officers and privileged crew members were generally spared the harshest penalties, while common sailors bore the brunt of punishment. However, the harsh discipline served a grim purpose. At sea, a moment's hesitation or defiance could spell disaster. The physical and psychological impact of these punishments was profound. Yet, despite the terror of punishment, sailors also developed a complex relationship with discipline. It was both a source of suffering and a mechanism of survival. Some captains ruled with brutal iron fists, while others tempered discipline with fairness or even kindness, earning the loyalty of their crews. Mutiny, though rare, was often born from the desperation and cruelty of harsh discipline. In the end, brutal discipline and punishments were an indelible part of the 1600s sailor's life. To be a sailor in the 1600s was to live with an ever-present shadow, the terrifying, unpredictable power of the sea itself. Beyond the daily grind of cramped quarters, meager food, and harsh discipline, there was the raw, primal fear of storms and shipwrecks. The ocean was a wild and untamable force, capable of turning a sturdy ship into splinters and sending entire crews to a watery grave. The ship's sails had to be quickly reefed or taken down to prevent them from tearing apart. The rigging and ropes needed constant tending to keep the ship maneuverable. The men climbed the wet, slippery masts, struggling against howling winds and lashing rain to secure the sails or adjust the ship's course. A vessel battered by the sea might be smashed against hidden rocks, driven onto a treacherous shore, or overwhelmed by waves too powerful to withstand. Many ships carried few lifeboats, and these were often insufficient for the entire crew. Those who could not escape the sinking vessel faced drowning or being battered against rocks and reefs. The wooden hull, no matter how well constructed, was vulnerable to the ocean's fury. Some were washed ashore on desolate islands or rocky coasts, facing new dangers in unfamiliar lands. Others were lost to the deep, swallowed by the sea without a trace. But for the sailors of the 1600s, the sea was a wild, terrifying force, beautiful and deadly, awe-inspiring and merciless. Prayers, rituals, and charms were used in hopes of calming the sea or appeasing its spirits. The storm was seen not just as a natural event, but as a test or punishment from higher powers. Superstitions about unlucky days, ominous signs, and the behavior of animals abounded, reflecting the deep human need to find meaning in chaos. The loss of life in shipwrecks was often catastrophic, wiping out crews and devastating families and communities back home. Broken masts, ripped sails, and shattered planks could spell disaster within moments. Nights were often sleepless, filled with the sounds of creaking wood and crashing waves. The threat shaped every decision aboard ship, influencing how men worked, rested, and prayed. Their courage in the face of such overwhelming threats is a testament to human resilience and spirit. Yet the constant threat of storms and shipwreck remained a grim reminder of the fragile balance between man and nature. The deck was slick with seawater, pitching wildly with each towering wave, threatening to throw men overboard. For the men aboard those vessels, every journey was a gamble with nature's fury, and the threat of death by storm was never far from their minds. Storms could arrive suddenly, without warning, sweeping across the horizon like dark, rolling walls of chaos. Without modern meteorological knowledge or instruments, sailors relied on their experience, the feel of the wind, and the changing color of the sky to anticipate danger. But even the most seasoned crews could be caught off guard. A clear morning could give way to a raging tempest by afternoon, and the calm sea could transform into a churning, frothing hellscape in minutes. Hypothermia was a real danger, especially for those exposed on deck. Exhaustion soon set in, sapping strength and willpower, and many sailors prayed for the storm to pass, knowing full well that it might not. When a storm struck, the crew was thrown into frantic action. Below deck, the chaos was no less terrifying. The ship's timbers groaned and creaked under the immense pressure of the storm. Water poured in through leaks and seams, flooding the lower compartments and threatening to drown those trapped inside. The air grew thick and stifling, mixed with the smell of salt, sweat, and fear. Sailors huddled in whatever shelter they could find, clinging to beams or each other as the ship shuddered and rolled. The cold was merciless. Rain and sea spray chilled men to the bone, and the wind sliced through soaked clothing like a blade. Shipwreck was the nightmare lurking behind every storm. In the face of a shipwreck, chaos reigned. Sailors scrambled to save themselves and their crewmates, throwing ropes, launching lifeboats, or swimming for shore. Survival was a matter of luck, skill, and sheer determination. The psychological toll of storms and shipwrecks was immense. The knowledge that death could come in an instant haunted sailors constantly. Many sailors turned to religion and superstition for comfort and protection. Despite the dangers, sailors continued to brave the seas, driven by necessity, duty, or the hope of fortune. The legacy of these fears shaped maritime history. Ship designs evolved, navigation techniques improved, and eventually, better forecasting reduced the element of surprise. Every voyage was a story of survival against the odds, and every storm a chapter written in sweat, fear, and courage. Life below deck on a 1600 sailing ship was an existence steeped in darkness, isolation, and relentless discomfort. While the open sea above promised vast horizons and the freedom of wind and waves, the reality beneath the wooden planks was grim and confining. Below deck, daylight was a scarce and fleeting visitor, limited to faint shafts of weak illumination through small portholes or grates. Often, these openings were few and far between, and their glass or lattice coverings became grimy with salt spray, grime, and neglect. The result was a murky twilight world where shadows clung to every corner. For sailors, the cramped underbelly of the ship was both home cut off from the sun, the open sky, and the sounds of the natural world. Sailors felt removed from life itself. These noises became the soundtrack of a life trapped within wooden walls, sometimes comforting, but often amplifying the sense of claustrophobia. Days blurred into nights in the dimness, and the lack of natural light disrupted sleep patterns and circadian rhythms, leaving men fatigued and disoriented. Personal belongings were minimal, and the close quarters meant that men were forced into constant proximity. Arguments and disputes over space, cleanliness, or noise were common, adding social strain to the physical discomfort. And prison a place where the senses were dulled, spirits tested, and the isolation from the outside world became almost unbearable. Ill sailors were cared for, in cramped infirmaries, or simply left to suffer among their comrades, further contributing to the fear and despair, but no less exposed to the unseen threats of disease, injury, or accidents. Sailors often went months or years without hearing news from home, with letters a rare and precious commodity. The isolation below deck mirrored the emotional distance from family and friends, intensifying feelings of loneliness and longing. It was a world where light was scarce, air was stale, and solitude was overwhelming, a hidden realm beneath. The waves where men faced not only the dangers of the sea, but the silent torment of confinement. Ventilation systems were primitive, and ship design prioritized cargo and armaments over crew comfort. It wasn't until centuries later that improvements in naval architecture and an increased understanding of sailors' needs led to better living conditions below deck. The darkness and cramped conditions made even small injuries dangerous, as infections could take hold and spread unchecked. Sailors learned to endure and make the best of their surroundings. Hammocks were adjusted for comfort, belongings carefully arranged, and routines established to impose order on chaos. The shared experience forged bonds between men who depended on each other for survival, creating a fragile community within the confines of the ship. The moment a sailor descended the narrow hatch into the lower decks, he left behind the sky's light and the sounds of the open sea. These rituals, while temporary distractions, were vital in maintaining morale and a sense of shared purpose. Coughs, colds, and chest infections were common, worsened by the constant exposure to dampness and poor hygiene. Many sailors experienced bouts of despair, anxiety, and depression. The constant confinement and lack of stimulation drained mental energy, leading to a sense of hopelessness. For some, this led to bouts of violence, self-harm, or even attempts to escape the ship by jumping overboard, an act fraught with peril, but sometimes seen as the only way out. The combination of stale air and darkness also bred mold and mildew, which clung to walls, clothing, and bedding, making the environment even more hostile to health. The cramped quarters were made up of low ceilings supported by heavy beams, wooden bulkheads, and narrow passageways. Sailors' bunks or hammocks hung close together, barely allowing a man to stretch out or turn without brushing against his neighbor. The tightness of the space was suffocating, leaving little room to move freely or find solitude. The air below deck was thick and stale, recycled again and again through the small openings. Without proper ventilation, the atmosphere quickly became oppressive. The mixture of sea salt, sweat, unwashed bodies, and the smell of stored provisioned salted meat, rancid biscuits, and moldy grains created a pungent, clinging stench. The damp wood absorbed moisture from the ocean and the breath of dozens of men, turning the entire space into a humid, heavy environment that felt like a tomb. Breathing was labored, and the lack of fresh air contributed to respiratory illnesses among the crew. Isolation below deck was not just physical, but also psychological. The monotony of the confined space was broken only by the sounds of the ship, the creak of timbers, the slap of waves against the hull, the drip of leaking water, and the murmurs or grumbles of fellow sailors. Privacy was non-existent. A sailor's hammock was little more than a narrow sling stretched between beams, barely his own. The psychological impact of such isolation could be profound. In this environment, sailors often developed coping mechanisms. Storytelling, singing sea shanties, and sharing superstitions provided some mental relief and fostered camaraderie. The isolation also heightened the sailors' sense of vulnerability. Below deck, they were physically removed from the immediate dangers of storms or battles. Medical care below deck was rudimentary. The ship's surgeon or barber surgeon worked in the same confined spaces, often with little equipment or knowledge. The emotional toll of being cut off from loved ones was significant. Despite these hardships, life below deck was a place of resilience and adaptation. Technological limitations of the era meant that these conditions persisted throughout the 1600s. For the 1600 sailor, however, the darkness and isolation were an inescapable part of their daily reality. Of fresh water made washing and cleaning a luxury few could afford, and the crew's clothing and bedding were infested with lice, fleas, and bedbugs. These pests not only caused discomfort, but spread disease, especially typhus. Isolation of the sick was difficult due to the cramped quarters. The stress of enduring illness, watching friends and comrades die, and facing one's own vulnerability led to despair, depression, and in some cases, madness. They enforced rudimentary hygiene rules, such as airing bedding, cleaning decks, and boiling water when possible. Fresh food was prioritized when near land, and occasional stops were made to restock on vegetables and herbs. Some voyages lost a third or more of their crew to disease, a grim reality that shaped maritime history and exploration. One sees a world where courage and survival were measured not only by skill with sails and swords, but also by the capacity to endure unseen, relentless enemies. The struggle against illness was as much a part of every voyage as navigation and battle, a silent fight waged in the shadows below deck. The hardships endured by these men, their pain, suffering, and perseverance remain a testament to the brutal reality of life at sea during this era. Some noted that beer or cider was safer to drink than stagnant water, and efforts were made to ration supplies carefully. Isolation and hopelessness haunted many sailors in their darkest hours. Ships often had a designated sickbay, but it was small and poorly equipped. The sick were isolated only as much as space allowed, increasing the risk of contagion. Fear and superstition sometimes complicated care, as illness was often interpreted as a sign of sin or divine wrath, leading to stigma or neglect of the afflicted. It would be centuries before navies formally adopted citrus and other fresh provisions as standard. Meanwhile, crews continued to suffer heavy losses, with disease often killing more men in battles or storms. Mental health, though poorly understood, was deeply affected by disease and the brutal conditions. Despite these overwhelming challenges, some captains and crews attempted to mitigate the horrors of disease. The introduction of lemon or lime juice as a preventive measure against scurvy was a breakthrough, but it was not widespread in the 1600s. The toll of illness aboard 1600 sailing ships was staggering. In reflecting on disease and medical care aboard ships of the 1600s, for sailors navigating the vast and unpredictable oceans of the 1600s, life was defined not only by the hardships of the sea itself, but also by a looming, constant threat, the fear of piracy and enemy ships. This fear permeated every voyage, casting a shadow over even the calmest waters and shaping the daily existence of every man aboard. To set sail was to enter a world where danger could erupt without warning, where survival often depended as much on sharp eyes and quick reflexes as on skill with the sails or knowledge of the stars. The great naval powers, Spain, England, France, the Dutch Republic, and Portugal, were locked in near constant conflict, competing for control of trade routes and colonies. Cannons roared as they fired broadsides, sending iron balls crashing into hulls and masts. Sails were shredded, decks torn apart, and lives lost in fierce exchanges. For sailors, the chaos of battle was terrifying. Smoke filled the air, obscuring vision. Explosions rocked the ship. Captains faced impossible decisions, whether to try to outrun a faster attacker, stand and fight, or surrender in the hope of mercy. Each option carried risks, and the outcome often depended on luck, seamanship, and the morale of the crew. And the screams of the wounded echoed over the crashing waves. Sailors knew stories of comrades captured, tortured, or killed. Families waited anxiously for news that might never come. The prospect of capture was a source of dread, as prisoners could face brutal conditions, enslavement, or death far from home. Captured crews faced imprisonment, harsh treatment, or forced labor, and the loss of a ship could be financially ruinous for owners and investors. It was a world with a line between commerce and conflict blurred, where the ocean was as much a battlefield as a highway, and where the shadow of piracy and war never lifted. Prayers for protection, offerings to sea gods, and the use of lucky charms were common. Sea shanties and storytelling fostered camaraderie, helping men face the dangers together. Convoys became common, grouping merchant vessels under naval escort for protection. These adaptations were necessary responses to the dangerous world sailors inhabited. This meant that merchant ships risked interception, not only by pirates, but also by enemy warships and privateers authorized by rival governments. Every day aboard a ship was a balance between hope and fear, between the dream of distant shores and the harsh reality of the dangers lurking on the waves. Sailors lived with this tension, knowing that survival depended on their skill, their luck, and their readiness to fight or flee at a moment's notice. The exploits of infamous pirates like Henry Morgan, Blackbeard, and Anne Bonny became legends, reflecting both the romanticized and brutal realities of piracy. Naval battles, such as the Anglo-Spanish War as engagements and the Dutch struggle for independence, underscore the geopolitical tensions that put merchant ships in harm's way. Watch duties were relentless lookouts, stationed high in the masts, kept constant vigil, eyes trained to identify friend from foe at great distances. Captains and crews trained for combat, drilling and boarding and repelling attacks. Letters of marque were sometimes issued, legalizing privateering state-sponsored piracy, allowing merchant ships to attack enemy vessels under their country's flag. This added complexity to the maritime world, where friend and foe could be difficult to discern. The crew learned to recognize the silhouettes and rigging of various ships, distinguishing between merchantmen, warships, and pirate vessels. Communication through flags, lantern signals, and cannon shots was essential for coordinating defense and signaling danger. These engagements were often more formal and protracted than pirate attacks, but no less deadly. Piracy in the 1600s was rampant, fueled by the rise of global trade and the intense competition between European powers for colonial dominance. The Caribbean Sea, with its maze of islands and busy shipping lanes, became notorious as a pirate's haven, but no ocean was truly safe. Pirates ranging from desperate outlaws to state-sanctioned privateers were skilled sailors who knew the seas intimately and struck with ruthless efficiency. Their targets were often richly laden merchant ships carrying precious cargoes: gold, silver, spices, textiles, sugar, tobacco, and other goods that fueled the burgeoning economies of Europe. The nature of piracy was brutal and terrifying. Pirates relied on surprise and overwhelming force, attacking swiftly to overwhelm the crews before they could mount an effective defense. Ships under pirate assault could find themselves boarded amid the roar of cannon fire and the clash of swords. A ship's silhouette, the flash of a sail on the horizon, or the glint of a lantern at night could send crews scrambling to battle stations. The anxiety was compounded by the unpredictability of the sea. Storms or fog could obscure danger until it was too late. The fear of capture was omnipresent, as pirates often tortured or killed those who resisted, and survivors faced uncertain fates. Some were pressed into piracy themselves, others sold into slavery or left to perish. The psychological impact of this constant threat was immense. Sailors lived in a state of heightened alertness, scanning the horizon ceaselessly for telltale signs of an approaching enemy. Pirates were not the only threat. The 1600s were an era of intense maritime rivalry. Naval battles could last hours or days, with ships maneuvering to gain the upper hand. The threat of piracy and naval attack influenced every facet of life aboard ship. Ships were often armed with cannons and small arms, blurring the lines between trade vessel and warship. Despite these precautions, many ships were lost to pirates or enemy forces. The fear was not merely tactical, but deeply personal. Sailors developed rituals, superstitions, and practices to cope with this fear. The historical record is filled with tales of piracy and naval conflict that illustrate this fear. This constant threat shaped maritime technology and strategy. Ship designs evolved to improve speed, maneuverability, and firepower. Ultimately, the fear of piracy and enemy ships was a defining element of life at sea in the 1600s. It demanded vigilance, courage, and resilience. This fear was not just a practical concern, but a shaping force in the identity and culture of sailors, influencing their behavior, relationships, and sense of purpose. Life aboard a 1600 sailing ship was defined by relentless labor, exhaustion, and an unending cycle of tasks that left sailors physically and mentally drained. The long hours spent managing sails, rigging, and ship maintenance under brutal conditions were not only a test of strength and skill, but also a key part of survival at sea. Ships operated around the clock, and the crew was divided into watches, typically lasting 4 hours. The sails were the ship's engine, catching the wind and propelling the vessel forward. But sails were large, heavy, and difficult to handle, especially in rough weather. Hoisting, trimming, reefing, and furling sails required coordinated effort from several men, all working together to keep the ship moving safely and efficiently. Wooden vessels required constant upkeep to remain seaworthy. Decks needed scrubbing to prevent rot, and keep them from becoming dangerously slippery. The hull had to be checked for damage and leaks patched. Sleep was fragmented and often insufficient, leading to exhaustion that compounded the difficulty of their tasks. There was little room for rest, and sailors had to push through pain, cold, and fatigue to keep the ship running. Ropes and rigging had to be inspected, repaired, or replaced. Tasks that might seem mundane on land were vital at sea. Failure to maintain the ship could mean disaster. This meant that sailors were expected to perform strenuous physical labor in all types of weather, be it the scorching sun, freezing cold, driving rain, or fierce storms. During storms, the work intensified dramatically. Sails had to be reefed to reduce wind pressure. Leaks needed patching, and crew had to be secured or risked being washed overboard. It was a world where rest was scarce, danger constant, and labor unending. Yet within this harsh reality, sailors found purpose, camaraderie, and a deep connection to the sea, a bond forged through sweat, toil, and shared endurance. The strain on men's bodies and minds was extreme, and survival depended on their ability to work as a unit under terrifying conditions. Sailors scrubbed decks with harsh sand and scrapers, a never-ending chore that was critical to the ship's condition and crew health. The sea showed no mercy, and the work demanded constant attention, precision, and endurance. Hunger and dehydration were common, weakening the crew further, but never halting the work demands. For these men, work was not a choice, but a necessity, an unforgiving rhythm that governed every moment of their days and nights. From the moment a sailor awoke, or rather, when his shift began, there was no respite. The monotony of repetitive tasks, punctuated by moments of extreme danger, created a stressful environment where focus was essential. Laziness or incompetence could be punished severely, as any failure risked the ship and crew's safety. The pressure to perform was immense, and sailors learned quickly to meet the demands or face consequences. Seamanship was a valued skill, and competence could mean the difference between life and death. The teamwork required to manage sails, and rigging forged bonds between men. Trust and coordination were essential, and a well-functioning crew was a formidable force against the sea's challenges. One of the most physically demanding tasks was managing the sails. Climbing the rigging tall, precarious networks of ropes and ladders reaching high into the masts was a daily necessity. Sailors had to ascend dozens of feet above the deck to adjust sails or look out for danger. This was dangerous work, performed in all conditions, often while the ship pitched and rolled beneath them. A slip could mean a fatal fall into the raging sea below. The physical strain was immense. Sailors used all their strength to haul heavy ropes and manipulate the sails, muscles burning with effort. Their hands were raw and calloused from constant contact with coarse rope, and blisters and cuts were common. Fatigue was a constant companion, yet the work never stopped. Beyond sail management, sailors were responsible for maintaining the ship itself. Cleaning was particularly grueling. Salt spray, bird droppings, and the detritus of daily life coated every surface. The work schedule was harsh and unyielding. Watches rotated, meaning a sailor might be on duty at any hour, including the dead of night. Meals were quick and modest, sometimes nothing more than hardtack biscuits and salted meat eaten hastily between duties. The mental toll was as heavy as the physical. The unending labor, combined with isolation from family and the harshness of life at sea, wore on sailors' spirits. Despite the hardships, sailors took pride in their work. The ship's officers kept strict discipline, ensuring that work continued without pause. Weather was the ever-present wild card. Calm seas could lull crews into a false sense of ease, but storms required all hands on deck. The long hours and grueling work shaped every aspect of life aboard a 1600 sailing ship. Life aboard a 1600 sailing ship was governed by a strict hierarchy and rigid social order that permeated every aspect of a sailor's existence. This system dictated not only who gave orders and who obeyed, but also who ate first, who slept where, and who was trusted with certain responsibilities. The captain's word was law, and his power extended beyond mere navigation and combat tactics. He controlled discipline, managed supplies, and was responsible for the crew's overall welfare, or at least for maintaining the semblance of it. Captains were often men with significant maritime experience, noble connections, or royal appointments, and their leadership style could mean the difference between a successful voyage and mutiny. This group was incredibly diverse, made up of seasoned seamen, pressed men forced into service, young apprentices, and even criminals pardoned or sentenced to serve at sea. Ordinary sailors lived in cramped quarters, worked long hours, and had little say in ship affairs. Sailors chafed under officers they viewed as tyrannical or incompetent, while officers struggled to maintain control over a restless and often unruly crew. The gap between the privileged few and the common men was stark, visible in every aspect of life aboard ship. They ate the meager rations last, slept in the most uncomfortable spaces, and were subject to harsh discipline. Mutinies, though relatively rare, were a terrifying threat for captains and officers. Sailors found camaraderie in their shared toil, dangers, and isolation, bonding over stories, sea shanties, and moments of respite. They were often sparked by perceived injustices, harsh treatment, or desperation during long, difficult voyages. The mere suspicion of mutiny could lead to paranoia and even more brutal discipline. Officers often mingled with merchants, officials, and townsfolk, while ordinary sailors remained confined to poor quarters, taverns, or even prisons. This separation reinforced class distinctions and the isolation many sailors felt from society on land. The hierarchy was essential for maintaining order and discipline on a vessel where chaos could mean disaster. Yet it also bred resentment, jealousy, and tension among the crew. Sailors learned their place quickly, understanding the consequences of stepping out of line. Obedience was demanded not only for discipline, but for survival. One man's failure could endanger everyone. Discipline was harsh, and punishments for perceived slights or failures were brutal and public. Chaplains or religious officers often supported the authority of captains and officers, preaching obedience and order as divine mandates. Superstitions about the sea, luck, and fate also influenced behavior, providing comfort or warning, but rarely challenging the hierarchy. Flogging was common, with victims tied to the ship as mast or belaying pins and whipped in front of their crewmates. Such spectacles reinforced the hierarchy, but also bred fear and hatred. Experienced men who had proven their competence and reliability could become bosun's mates or petty officers, overseeing certain tasks and enforcing discipline among the crew. It shaped how sailors saw themselves and each other, how they navigated authority and rebellion, and how they endured the endless hardships of maritime life. These men walked a fine line, both part of the rank and file, but also agents of authority, often resented for their role. They wore finer clothing when possible, and had access to tobacco and alcohol in ways ordinary sailors did not. Even small comforts, a warm blanket, a place below deck out of the elements, or permission to rest during certain hours were symbols of status. Understanding this social order reveals much about the daily struggles, interactions, and conflicts that shaped life at sea. These roles required particular skills and granted a measure of status and autonomy. The surgeon, for instance, despite his often humble social background, was crucial to the crew's survival and could wield significant influence. The carpenter maintained the ship's structure and was essential in emergencies. These specialists sometimes acted as a buffer between officers and ordinary sailors, commanding respect for their expertise. At the very top of the ship's social pyramid stood the captain, the unquestioned authority and final arbiter of all decisions. Beneath the captain were the officers, including the first mate, second mate, and sometimes third mate, depending on the ship's size and importance. These men acted as intermediaries between the captain and the ordinary sailors, overseeing daily operations and enforcing orders. Officers were typically better educated and more privileged than the common crew, and they enjoyed superior accommodations, better food, and greater respect. Their roles required a mix of seamanship, leadership, and sometimes cruelty, as discipline was strictly enforced. Below the officers were the specialist crew members, the ship's surgeon, carpenter, sailmaker, and sometimes a cook or gunner. The vast majority of the crew were ordinary sailors, the men who performed the exhausting physical labor of sailing, maintenance, and combat. Within this large group of common sailors, a further informal hierarchy existed. The strict social order was necessary for a ship's operation, but it also created tension and conflict. Privileges varied widely. Officers and specialists ate better food, enjoyed more space and comfort, and were spared the harshest punishments. Ordinary sailors often found themselves at the mercy of those above them. Resentment simmered below the surface and sometimes erupted into open rebellion. Social divisions also affected relationships among sailors. Friendships and alliances were often formed along rank lines, but the shared hardships of life at sea could also foster solidarity across divisions. Religion and superstition played a role in reinforcing the social order. The social order extended to how sailors were treated during shore leave and interactions with local populations. Despite the tensions, the hierarchy aboard ship was accepted as a necessary structure. Without it, the chaos of the sea and the complexity of sailing a large vessel could not be managed. Throughout the voyage, this social order influenced every interaction, decision, and moment of life aboard. The life of a sailor in the 1600s was not only physically demanding and perilous, but also deeply taxing on the mind and spirit. Beyond the storms, battles, and exhausting labor lay an often overlooked but profound struggle, the psychological toll of extended isolation and homesickness. Sailing in a time before modern communication, sailors were cut off from their families, friends, and familiar world for months or even years at a stretch. This separation bred loneliness, despair, and a mental strain that gnawed at men's resilience and sometimes pushed them to the brink of madness. To understand this psychological burden, it's important to first appreciate the nature of voyages during the 1600s. Sailors were surrounded by others, yet true companionship was rare. The harsh conditions, competition for scarce resources, and strict hierarchy often kept men wary and distant from one another. Trust was hard won, and many found it difficult to form deep bonds that might alleviate their isolation. Ships left port with uncertain destinations, their length dictated by the vast distances to colonies, trading posts, or exploration routes. Sailors wrote in journals of sleepless nights, haunted by dreams of home, a yearning that sometimes turned to bitterness or despair. Music, particularly sea shanties, was a vital outlet, helping to build camaraderie and lift spirits. And knowledge that they were part of a crew facing the same dangers and hardships forged powerful connections. However, these bonds were fragile, as deaths from disease or battle were frequent and losses deeply felt. Storytelling, whether recounting tales of distant lands or imagining life ashore, provided mental escape. It underscored the harshness of maritime existence, reminding us that the ocean's challenges were not only physical, but profoundly human. The endurance of these men was a testament to their courage in the face of solitude, separation, and the deep longing for home that accompanied every voyage. Shared rituals, such as communal meals or religious observances, fostered a sense of community. Letters home, when possible, were treasured lifelines, though often scarce. Religious services might provide solace for some, but for others, faith was challenged by the harsh realities of life at sea and the absence of those they prayed for. Instances of madness aboard ships were recorded, with men becoming incoherent, aggressive, or catatonic. The resilience of sailors was remarkable, They endured physical dangers and harsh discipline, but the emotional strain was equally formidable. Some sailors struggled to reintegrate with family and society after months or years away, having changed in ways difficult to articulate. The sea left its mark, not just on their bodies, but on their minds and hearts. The confined environment amplified these conditions, and there was no formal support, or treatment madness was feared, and often punished or ignored. Superstitions and folklore grew in popularity, providing explanations for misfortune and a semblance of control in an uncontrollable world. This emotional strain could weaken the immune system, making men more susceptible to illness or injury. Some turned to alcohol or other vices to dull the pain, while others withdrew, sinking into silence and depression. Journeys that might today take days or weeks often extended into months. A round trip could last a year or more. Throughout this time, sailors were confined to the close quarters of the ship, surrounded by the endless expanse of sea and sky. The world they knew, homes, towns, and loved ones, receded into distant memory, replaced by the relentless monotony of ocean waves and the sounds of creaking timber. Fear and suspicion bred an atmosphere of mistrust, while the lack of external contact made rumors and superstition flourish. Leadership had to be constantly vigilant to manage not only the physical, but also the emotional well-being of the crew. For many sailors, the initial excitement of adventure and escape from terrestrial worries soon gave way to profound loneliness. The ship was a floating prison of sorts, where contact with the outside world was impossible. Letters were rare, and news from home was non-existent until the ship returned. This severance from loved ones struck at the heart of a sailor's emotional well-being. Memories of family gatherings, children's laughter, or a spouse's embrace became bittersweet reminders of what was lost each day at sea. The psychological effects of this isolation were intense. Sailors reported feelings of despair, a deep ache for home that no physical comfort could ease. The monotony of the sea compounded these emotions. Days blurred into one another with little variation sunrise, labor, meager meals, nightfall offering few distractions from the heavy weight of solitude. The endless horizon, both beautiful and oppressive, seemed to mock their separation from solid ground and human connection. Loneliness was not merely the absence of company, but a profound sense of being cut off from the social and emotional fabric that sustained human life. Homesickness became a common affliction, more than nostalgia. It was a painful longing that affected morale and physical health. The ship's environment offered few remedies. There was no privacy, no quiet space for reflection, and little in the way of comforting rituals. Mental health issues sometimes manifested in more severe ways. Prolonged isolation, combined with physical exhaustion and stress, could lead to anxiety, paranoia, or hallucinations. The psychological toll also affected group dynamics. Tensions flared more easily when men were emotionally fragile, leading to conflicts, fights, or even mutiny. Despite the hardships, sailors found ways to cope and create pockets of comfort. Some sailors formed strong friendships and bonds that became surrogate families, helping to fill the emotional void left by distance from home. The psychological impact of isolation and homesickness was an invisible battle fought silently but relentlessly. It shaped not only individual experiences, but the overall atmosphere aboard ship. The return to port was a time of immense relief and joy, but also anxiety. In some, the psychological toll of isolation and homesickness was a defining feature of the sailor's life in the 1600s. Aboard a 1600 ship, desperation brewed slowly. It wasn't always visible in loud protests or drawn swords, but it lived beneath the surface in silent glares, whispered complaints, and clenched jaws. The conditions were often grim: rotting food, backbreaking labor, violent punishment, brutal officers, endless weeks of isolation, and the looming threat of death by disease, drowning, or starvation. Most men endured, but sometimes the pressure reached a breaking point. Others were more subtle, like refusing to obey orders, slowing down work, or attempting to steer the ship toward a friendly port. In the Dutch and English East India Companies, long voyages and pitiful conditions frequently tested men's loyalty. Spanish galleons and Portuguese caravels weren't immune either. Captains who sensed a shift in mood might respond with violence. Executions were carried out in front of the entire crew, sometimes even mid-voyage. Captains were often elected, officers could be voted out, and spoils were divided fairly. Even just the whisper of one could disrupt a ship's morale. They were expendable. Many were press-ganged into service, forced aboard ships against their will. If these men rebelled, it wasn't just a mutiny against a captain. It was rebellion against an entire system of exploitation. These incidents were celebrated in secret circles, passed down as sailor lore, a hidden history of the sea's quiet resistance. Ships were microcosms of the world's inequalities, and when sailors mutinied, they exposed the cracks in the empire's foundation. Most sailors, despite their misery, chose to endure. When trapped in the middle of the ocean, with no land in sight and little hope, a man might risk everything just for the chance to steer his own fate. It was never a guarantee of freedom, but for some, it was the only freedom left to hope for. They made small, defiant choices, dragging their feet on orders, hiding better rations, singing rebellious songs when the officers were out of earshot. These minor acts of rebellion kept them sane, even if they stopped short of full uprising. Sailors lived and worked in close quarters. Rumors traveled quickly, whether true or not. The ringleaders might be flogged until their backs were raw, chained in the hold for weeks, or left to starve. Were they just stories? Or were they the first winds of a storm that would come not from the clouds above, but from the hearts of the men beside you? Others were forced to walk the plank or marooned on tiny islands with no chance of rescue. These tales circulated widely among sailors, both as warnings and as dark inspiration. The line between hero and villain blurred depending on who told the story. If one ship returned to port having killed its captain and sailed without incident, other crews might be inspired to do the same. The authorities knew this and cracked down hard. Laws were passed declaring mutiny a capital offense. Naval courts dealt with suspected mutineers harshly, often with little regard for fairness. Many sailors drawn into mutiny looked to the pirate model not out of romanticism, but because it offered a life where their voices mattered. Some mutinies weren't about taking over a ship to escape, but converting the vessel into a pirate ship, recasting the entire purpose of the voyage under new, self-governed terms. The accused would be tied to the mast, interrogated, and then hanged or shot without trial. These brutal displays were meant to serve as warnings, but they also stoked resentment. Killing a man without evidence could make him a martyr. And that, too, was dangerous. The global spread of empire brought with it a growing awareness among sailors. The farther they were from home, the more vulnerable their leaders became. The nature of the rebellion often depended on the leadership among the mutineers. Was there a charismatic boatswain who could rally the men? They might favor one group of sailors over another, playing men against each other to maintain control. Officers were often rotated, so no one crew got too loyal to a specific leader who might challenge the captain as rule. But the most successful captains knew the value of basic decency. They maintained order through a balance of respect and firmness. Mutinies were less likely to occur on ships where men felt heard, fed, and paid. A clever navigator who knew how to reach land. A surgeon who could patch up wounds if violence broke out. When it did, the result was mutiny, a terrifying, dangerous, and often desperate act of rebellion at sea. Mutiny wasn't a decision made lightly. The consequences, if caught, were dire public hanging, flogging, or being marooned on a barren island with nothing but a bottle of water and a pistol. Yet for some sailors, the sheer cruelty of life aboard ship left them feeling like they had little left to lose. These were men driven not by ideology, but by survival. Mutiny was never common, but it wasn't unheard of, and captains feared it as much as they feared storms or enemy fire. The roots of rebellion often began in the quietest of places below deck, in the shadows, during the dead of night. Sailors would gather in secret to whisper grievances, each man weighing his odds. Your rations have dwindled to hardtack, crawling with weevils, and the water smells like vinegar. Your back bears the scars of last week's flogging for a minor mistake, and the officer who beat you now demands you climb the mast during a storm. A captain hoards fresh food for himself and his favorites. You haven't been paid since last year. One of your friends died last week, thrown overboard with barely a word. You start to wonder if you'd rather die fighting than continue living like this. And you're not alone in that thought. Complaints might range from unfair punishment and starvation to unpaid wages or a mad, tyrannical captain. The 1600s were a time when discipline was maintained with a lash, and many commanders believed fear was the only way to keep order. But fear, when overused, could backfire spectacularly. Imagine you're a sailor who hasn't seen land in 7 months. Mutinies took many forms. Some were swift and brutal, a rush of men, overwhelming the officers in their sleep, blood on the deck by morning. One of the most infamous examples of mutiny came from later centuries, the 1789 mutiny on the HMS Bounty, but seeds of rebellion were sown just as easily on 1600s merchant ships, privateers, and naval vessels alike. Punishment for suspected mutiny was often swift and terrifying, even if the actual plot hadn't yet taken form. Captains who ruled too harshly lived in constant fear. Some slept with pistols under their pillows, or built hidden compartments to escape to in case of uprising. There's also the matter of democracy at sea. Pirate crews, though feared and hated, operated under surprisingly egalitarian systems. One reason mutinies were so feared is that they were contagious. Some rebellions had wider social roots. Sailors were not merely angry about food or discipline. They were often the underclass of society, with few rights and no security. There are also stories of failed mutinies, where the plan was discovered just before it could be executed. Interestingly, not all mutinies ended in disaster. In some rare cases, mutinous crews succeeded in overthrowing cruel captains and steering their ship to a safer or freer life. Of course, not every discontented crew turned to mutiny. Mutiny, at its core, was about reclaiming control in a world where sailors had none. So as the ship rocked beneath your feet and the sea stretched endlessly to the horizon, you might start listening more closely to the quiet murmurs in the dark corners below deck. You stand at the edge of the deck, staring into the endless dark swell of the ocean. The wind cuts through your clothes, and the salt dries your lips. But something else gnaws at you, something deeper than discomfort. It was survival. Passages from Scripture were read aloud, and services were held when weather and time allowed. For sailors from deeply religious societies, this was more than routine. Life at sea was unpredictable, and in the absence of real explanations for illness, sudden storms, or bad luck, sailors built a world of beliefs to help make sense of things. A woman aboard was considered unlucky, but if she was naked, the superstition claimed she might calm the sea. Whistling was forbidden. It was said to challenge the wind, to dare it to blow stronger. Cutting your nails on a ship brought misfortune. Killing an albatross, a bird believed to carry the souls of dead sailors, was an unspeakable offense. On their first crossing of the equator, for example, they might be subjected to strange ceremonies, shaving their heads, being dunked in water, or made to kiss a greasy belly painted to represent King Neptune. These rituals weren't just jokes. They were steeped in centuries of tradition, part of a sailor's baptism into the brotherhood of the sea. Superstition gave meaning to suffering. The man who did so was often ostracized or worse, blamed if the voyage turned bad. The names for parts of the ship, the way directions were given, the songs sung during long night watches, they were soaked in ritual. Glowing lights on the masts, called St. Elmo's fire, were interpreted as spirits or divine signals, depending on the sailor's belief. But even they, when pressed to the edge, when the sails were torn and the hull was groaning under the weight of the waves, would find themselves crossing themselves, or muttering half-remembered prayers. It was in these moments that belief wasn't a choice. It was instinct. To see them dancing around the rigging during a storm was terrifying and wondrous all at once. They needed morale to stay high, but they also feared that certain beliefs could spread panic. If a crew came to believe the ship was cursed, or that a particular sailor brought bad luck, it could lead to isolation, violence, or even mutiny. Without it, the sea might consume not just the body, but the mind. Captains had to balance truth and illusion carefully. Sometimes they used superstition to their advantage, threatening that those who disobeyed might anger the sea gods. You kissed the metal at your throat before every storm. You never whistled. You never said the word drowned out loud. You carried the Bible tucked inside your sea chest, even if you never opened it. Other times, they stomped it out, demanding order over chaos. Some words were never spoken aloud. Certain days were considered cursed, and strange dreams were shared like omens, especially when a man dreamed of his family or saw fire at sea, a known sign, they thought, of impending doom. There were no funerals in churches, no carved headstones or weeping family members. When a man died at sea of illness, accident, or punishment, he was sewn into a canvas shroud with a weight at his feet and slid overboard. A whispered story of a ghost ship sighted in the fog. These things reminded sailors that they were part of something bigger than themselves, that their suffering had meaning, that someone or something might be watching over them. Sometimes a brief prayer was spoken, sometimes not, but often a hush would fall over the crew, not just out of grief, but fear. Far from the shore, far from cities or firelight, the heavens seemed impossibly close. You could believe, then, in angels, in fate, in gods old and new, in the idea that your life mattered. Who would be next? Had the man's spirit truly gone to heaven, or would it linger in the waves? That's why figureheads carved as bare-breasted women were often nailed to the bows of ships, a desperate offering to the waves. When your day could end with a snapped mast or a deadly fall from the rigging, you needed some sense that you had some control over your fate. It was a lifeline connection to home, to hope, and to the belief that there was order beyond the chaos of the sea. It's the sense that you're a speck in a vast, unknowable world where the rules are different, where man is small and nature is indifferent, not just from fear, but from the overwhelming need to beg forgiveness or protection from the divine. These things weren't just mementos. They were armor, protection from the unknowable forces they felt pressing in around them. They might not have understood germs or meteorology, but they understood fear, and fear demands belief. They'd cross themselves, kiss religious tokens, whisper prayers their mothers taught them as children. They believed, sometimes desperately, that God might hear them over the roar of the wind. And in that terrifying vastness, you cling to something: faith, superstition, a whispered charm in the night, anything to help you believe that you're not alone out here. Faith, for many 1600 sailors, was not just a matter of church-going or prayer. Religion played a formal role aboard most ships, especially those commissioned by Catholic or Protestant powers. Some captains insisted on prayers before dawn and again at sundown. When storms struck and lightning cracked across the sky, it was common to see hardened, sunburned men fall to their knees and weep. But alongside religion, sometimes woven right into it, was something older and stranger: superstition. A black cat aboard could bring luck or doom, depending on the direction it walked. There were entire categories of sailor lore. These weren't just idle tales. Sailors believed in them deeply. They repeated them, passed them down, enforced them. It gave structure to a life without structure. New sailors were often initiated into this belief system through both gentle teasing and harsh rituals. Faith and superstition also shaped how death was handled aboard. Sailors believed the sea could claim more than just your body. They thought it could take your soul, too. That's why many carried talisman small crosses, medals of saints, rings, pieces of hair wrapped in oilskin. Even language aboard was shaped by this blend of religion and superstition. There was also the belief in signs from the sea itself. Dolphins swimming near the bow were good luck. Not all men believed. Some mocked the rituals. Interestingly, many captains both enforced and gently discouraged superstition. Yet for all the darkness in these beliefs, there was comfort, too. A prayer before sleep, a charm stitched into your jacket. In the rare moments of calm, when the sea turned still and the stars appeared, sailors often lay on their backs on the deck, staring up into the night. Faith wasn't just a shield against fear. It was the thread that kept men tethered to hope. And so you, like so many others, kept your little rituals. Because maybe, just maybe, something out there was listening. And that was enough to keep going. You had already come to terms with storms. The sudden ones, the long, howling ones, the ones that tossed the ship like it was no heavier than a loaf of bread. There were no wardrobes, no changes of clothing apart from the one spare set, if you had it. And even then, it too was probably soaked. There was no shade on the open deck, and your wool clothing, stiff with salt, trapped the heat against your skin. You'd sweat and sweat until your shirt was soaked, but it made no difference. The canvas beneath you was damp, and your blanket had long ago stopped offering any real warmth. If you were lucky, you'd fall asleep before the cold set into your bones. Your food spoiled faster in the heat. The biscuits grew weevils. The salt pork turned sour. You wrung out your socks and hung them on a line near the galley. You stood near the cooking fire, even if only for a moment, trying to absorb its heat. You pressed your back to the warm chimney bricks. You lined your boots with extra cloth or paper. You shared warmth with another man during night watch, shoulder to shoulder, back to back, not out of friendship, but survival. You whispered curses into the wind. You dreamed of sunlit fields and dry linen. You prayed to sweat again, just to feel dry afterward. In the cold, your hands grew clumsy, and accidents became more frequent. It carved at the mind. You saw it in the ones who stopped talking, who stared blankly into the water, who refused to eat or woke screaming. Every rope hauled in the rain, every sail furled in the wind, every barrel lifted in the heat. It all happened under the eye of the weather. You were nothing but a speck to the sun, a flicker to the cold, a whisper to the wind. The world above the waves made no promise of comfort. It offered only motion and weather and the endless cycle of exposure. But still you stood your post. Still you swabbed the deck. Still you breathed, teeth chattering or skin sweating, waiting for the next day, hoping it might bring just a little warmth. Or at the very least, no rain. It didn't pause for your misery. The ocean didn't care. You tied off lines with fingers so numb you couldn't feel the rope. You climbed the rigging with frozen knees. You bailed water while your back boiled with sunburn. And when your shift was over, when your limbs ached and your eyes stung with salt, you went back below deck to a wet, dark hole and slept with damp straw and the smell of mildew in your nose. The weather was a weight you couldn't put down. It never stopped pressing. No one escaped it. You could try to outlast it, endure it, but it always came back. Men slipped on wet decks and broke fingers or ribs. Frost made the ropes stiff and brittle. The rain soaked your powder, made it useless. The damp encouraged rot and mildew. Your clothes, your boots, even your hammock, they all stank. Mold grew on the beams. Rats nested in warm, wet corners of the hold. The ship itself seemed to suffer along with the crew. If not, you lay there shivering, curling in on yourself like a child. The cold was a thief. It stole your strength, your focus, even your will. And when it combined with the damp, when your clothes were wet and your feet had been soaking for days, that's when the pain began to settle in. You'd wake up with swollen fingers, blistered toes, aching joints. Sometimes your skin peeled away from your heels, or your nails turned black. Men got trench foot, frostbite, strange fevers that made them hallucinate. All from being wet. All from living in the kind of cold that never gave you even an hour's peace. The sun beat down from above, and the ocean reflected it back from below. A double furnace that turned your brain to paste. It would roll in like a ghost, gray and dense and wet, and it made everything feel heavier. The ropes, the sails, even your own limbs. You'd stand your watch, barely able to see your own hands. Voices disappeared into it. Footsteps vanished after a few paces. You couldn't tell if another ship was 20 yards away or 2 miles. Everything was muffled. You started to feel like the fog was inside you, filling your lungs and your ears, making the world slow and strange. It didn't lift quickly. Sometimes it stayed for days, draping the ship in silence and mist and leaving every surface slick with dew. The wood grew soft. The canvas drooped. You could hear it drip-tap, tap all through the night. You could see it in the eyes of the other men, how they started to blink more slowly, stumble, forget what they were doing. Heat exhaustion wasn't some rare danger. It happened every week, every day. Men passed out beside the mainmast or collapsed at the helm. Sometimes they recovered. Sometimes they didn't. The sea had a way of reaching everywhere. It seeped through the seams of the ship. It crept into your boots. It soaked your hammock. It gathered in the folds of your blanket until it was more sponge than cover. The very air you breathed seemed heavy with salt and mist. You could never get truly dry. That was a luxury for people who lived on land. You expected them. But no one really prepared you for the daily, relentless wear of the weather, the kind that gnawed at your body and spirit, not with fury, but with dull, merciless persistence. You could be roasting under the sun in the morning and freezing by evening. The wind would change, and suddenly it felt like the ship had sailed into another world. That's when the real suffering started. Rain blew sideways across the deck and soaked you to the skin in seconds. Your fingers went numb, and your boots filled with freezing water. You'd work the ropes with raw hands, half blind from the stinging rain, your teeth clacking like dice in a cup. No one ever talked about how cold it was. They just groaned and got on with it. There was no time to complain. It wasn't the storm that wore you down. It was everything in between. The constant damp, the searing sun, the freezing night air, the dripping sails, the rotting wood, and the way your clothes never seemed to dry, even on days when the sky was blue. You woke up wet. You went to sleep wet. Your shirt clung to your back, damp with either seawater or sweat, depending on the hour. In the tropical heat, the sun could kill you just as surely as any wave. It scorched the back of your neck until it cracked and bled. Then there were the cold days, bitter, lashing cold. At night, you huddled in your hammock like a drowned rat. The fog, too, had its role to play. It wasn't just the weather. It was what the weather did to everything else. You tried to fight it in small ways. Some men cracked under it. The constant exposure wore down more than just the body. And still, you worked. The sea was always there to remind you that you were small. Not just physically, but in importance. You never truly knew where you were. That was the haunting truth at sea. You could hold a compass in your calloused hand and consult the stars each night. But in the 1600s, navigation was as much guesswork as science. Your world stretched far beyond sight, beyond certainty. A world of shifting winds, deceptive currents. A chain of islands might be drawn too close to one another. A reef might not be drawn at all. There was no reliable way to calculate your east-west position. You might drift hundreds of miles off course without knowing it, and landfall didn't guarantee safety. Narrow harbors, sandbars, submerged rocks, and swirling currents could still wreck you within sight of shore. The sea didn't care how close you were to safety. A single misjudged turn could splinter your ship in seconds. Not yet. You relied on dead reckoning, literally guessing your current position based on your last known one, accounting for speed and direction over time. You couldn't blink too long. You couldn't be distracted. You'd feel it, sometimes, a change in the sea's rhythm, the waves slapping at the hull differently, the ship lurching in a strange, uneasy way. The veterans might mutter something under their breath, a warning, but by then, it could be too late. One moment of inattention, and the ship could plow into a sandbar, a reef, or an enemy vessel, and it would be you they blamed, if you survived. Ed reckoning, they said, because of how many died from errors in it. A cracking boom that shook the ship from mast to keel. You ran for the pumps, for the lifeboats, for anything, but deep down, you knew it might already be over. If you were lucky, you'd reach the shore. If you were unlucky, you'd vanish into the blackness, nameless and unmourned. They'd drop anchor for days, waiting for the sky to clear. But that cost money, time, rations, tempers flared. Some ships pushed on, through the fog, past the warnings, trusting their charts or their bravado. Men thrown from hammocks, barrels splitting, cold seawater rushing in like claws. You'd mark it on a chart with a cross, cold, uncaring, being lost without story, without record, swallowed by oceans that would never confess. Every expedition into the New World or around Africa's southern cape meant venturing into vast stretches no one had mapped. No one knew what lay there. Shoals? Icebergs? Hostile shores? All of it was possible, and you, poor sailor, had no say in the matter. You clung to the hope that someone on board, captain, navigator, lookout, knew what they were doing. You'd hope that mark matched the truth. It rarely did. You'd look out over the endless sea and realize how small you were, how fragile. A storm might break you. A rock might skewer your hull. A single misread chart could mean 100 lives lost to silence. It wouldn't be solved until more than a century later, long after countless ships had gone down in silence, their positions never recorded, their wrecks swallowed whole. Here be dragons, they sometimes joked, but it wasn't funny when you were the one peering into a fog so thick it swallowed the horizon, praying you didn't hear the crunch of hull on rock. And maps so riddled with blanks and errors, they might as well have been imagined. Of sailors who trusted their charts too much. Of islands that didn't exist and coasts that rose suddenly out of nowhere. The unknown was terrifying, but it was also filled with promise. Gold, trade, new lands. Your captain might get rich. You might, if you survived, get your promised share. But the price was often a grave marked by a storm-smashed hull and an ocean that refused to give back the dead. The feel of the mud or sand stuck to the bottom could help identify where you were, in theory. One stormy night, with no visible stars and the wind screaming through the rigging, the captain might call a course based on nothing but memory and instinct. You'd all follow, silent and tight-jawed, knowing that a single degree off could mean shipwreck on some jagged rock none of you had ever seen. But if you were in unfamiliar waters, you might as well be sailing blindfolded. And if the wind was strong or the current swift, there was no time to stop and take careful readings. You had to trust your gut. You didn't laugh at those tailies. You couldn't. You might be next. When you were a sailor, every journey meant gambling with the unknown. The maps your captain used had been hand-copied, passed down, and often based more on rumor than reality. Latitude could be estimated using the sun and sextant, sure, but longitude? That was the real mystery. Even with the stars above, cloudy skies could keep you guessing for days. You would hear tales, whispered at port taverns, of entire expeditions vanishing. Sometimes your captain would order a lead line thrown overboard, weighted with tallow to gather a sample of the seabed. That's how people died. There was no radio, no lighthouse warnings, no GPS. And if you were a lookout on the bow, peering into mist, wind stinging your eyes, you were the only thing standing between safety and disaster. The ocean held secrets beneath its surface. Currents that pulled ships into ice fields. Eddies that spun smaller vessels like toys. Then there were the uncharted waters. And yet, oddly enough, you hoped to reach those edges of the world. Even skilled pilots made mistakes. It happened more often than people liked to admit. Sometimes you'd hear the groan of wood twisting under strange pressure. The lookout would scream something you couldn't hear. Then, the impact. In those moments, there was no order. The darkness swallowed every command. The candles blew out. No rescue. No signal fires. No chance. Just a wooden cross back home, if someone remembered you. Some captains turned overly cautious. Those were the ones you heard about in the next port, in hushed tones. Gone. The worst part? When a ship vanished, no one ever knew exactly how or where. You'd stare at the compass, and it stared back. Your life, your death, might come down to the angle of a star you couldn't even see. That was the fear of sailing the 1600 seas. Not just drowning, but disappearing. And so you prayed. You whispered to gods you half believed in. You scratched charms into wood, because if they didn't, the sea would take you, and no one would ever know why. The ship finally docked. The creaking timbers, the anchors rumble into the water, the rush of movement from deck to dock. After months at sea, you step onto land again, but it doesn't feel like relief. The ground seems to sway beneath your feet, your body still adjusted to the constant motion of the sea. The scent of salt is replaced by rot and smoke. The noise of gulls gives way to shouting vendors, whinnying horses, and the clang of distant blacksmiths. Land at last. And yet your burdens remain. There's no grand welcome waiting for you, no promised reward or celebration. For all your sweat and suffering, your pay, if it ever arrives, is likely short. Most captains find a reason to deduct a portion. Lost tools, damaged rigging, misconduct. A few silver coins for months of labor. You clutch them tightly, knowing how quickly they'll vanish. The port is teeming with life, but it doesn't feel safe. Pickpockets roam the alleys. Brawls erupt in taverns over spilt ale and imagined slights. The brothels call to you, voices like sirens, promising warmth and affection. But you've learned better. Behind the lace curtains and painted smiles lies danger. Disease, debt, and deception. You've seen too many shipmates taken by a fever they caught on shore. You search for a place to sleep. The inns near the docks are cheap and dirty. Straw mats teeming with lice, rooms filled with mold. You pay anyway. The thought of lying down in a real bed, even if it's no more than a plank with a blanket, draws you in. You lie awake staring at the ceiling, unsure whether you miss the sound of waves or dread returning to them. The drink is tempting. Rum is everywhere, and it numbs the aches in your body and mind. But the more you drink, the more the sea haunts you. You dream of drowning, of ropes snapping, of screams lost in the wind. Still, you drink. You're not the only one. Entire taverns brim with men like you. Eyes dulled, knuckles scarred, hearts hollow. When you try to leave, the land keeps pulling you down. You might be press-ganged, forced into another ship's crew before you've even recovered. One moment you're staggering out of a tavern. The next you're waking up in a dark hold, wrists bound, headed back out to sea with strangers. It happens every day. If you're lucky enough to have family nearby, they may not even recognize you. You've grown leaner, rougher, darker. Your skin, once pale, is now leathery from wind and sun. Your beard is thick, and your voice hoarse. You've seen things they wouldn't understand. You've killed rats with your bare hands, stitched your own wounds with sail thread, buried friends at sea. What do you talk about when they ask what it was like? Some men leave the sea for good. They try to farm or find work as laborers. But their bodies don't adjust. Knees ache, backs stiffen, hands shake. And most employers don't want a man who has only known how to tie knots and haul sails. Your skills at sea mean little on land. You're often seen as rough, uncivilized, even dangerous. Many turn to crime. You've watched shipmates join smuggling rings, run contraband, or pick pockets in crowded markets. The sea didn't kill them, but the city might. And when they're caught, it's a harsh sentence. Years in prison, or worse, the gallows. You attend their hangings in silence, hat removed, trying not to think how close you came to that fate. Sometimes the only real escape is re-enlisting. Back onto another ship, another voyage, another gamble. The sea is cruel, but it's familiar. On land, you feel aimless, vulnerable. At least at sea, you know the rules. You know where to sleep, when to eat, what to do. You hate it, but it's home. There are rare moments of beauty on land. A child's laughter in the market, the scent of bread baking, the warm touch of a kind stranger. But they never last. The shadows are always close. You flinch at loud noises, brace against sudden winds, dream of ropes tightening around your chest. No one tells young boys what it's really like. They hear songs about adventure and riches, not about the long days in wet boots or the captain's lash. No one sings about watching a man die of fever or falling into debt because your pay never came. They don't talk about the sailor's life on shore, broke, bruised, and forgotten. Even the church is no comfort. You sit on hard wooden pews, trying to feel something. The priest blesses you, but his words feel distant. You've spent too long at sea, where prayers are whispered into storms and hope floats on barrels of rainwater. You stare at the stained glass, wondering if any of those saints ever went to sea. And then comes the summons. Another ship, another voyage. You tell yourself you'll say no this time, that you'll rest longer, find better work, stay safe. But the coins are running out. Your boots are wearing thin, and the landlord is eyeing you. The docks beckon again, sails flapping, ropes creaking, barrels rolling. You stand on the gangplank, bag in hand, heart heavy. The captain doesn't smile. The bosun doesn't greet you. They nod curtly. You're not special. You're just another hand. But as you step aboard, part of you exhales. The chaos of land fades. You know the sea will punish you, break you. But at least you know where you stand. For a sailor in the 1600s, life on shore wasn't a return to peace. It was another battlefield. You were caught between worlds, unwanted in both, always drifting. And somehow, heartbreakingly, the unforgiving sea could feel more like home than the land you longed for. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the brutal, lonely, and often heartbreaking life of a 1600s sailor. From the unforgiving waves and deadly storms to the fleeting moments of rest on land that were often just as cruel, we've uncovered the harsh truths behind one of history's most romanticized roles. These men weren't adventurers by choice. They were survivors, drifting from port to port, battling both the sea and the society that forgot them when they returned. If you found this journey eye-opening, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more immersive historical explorations just like this. Every week, we bring you stories from the past that were anything but simple. Stories of struggle, silence, strength, and survival. Leave a comment below. What part of a sailor's life shocked you the most? Would you have survived a single voyage? And as always, thank you for watching. Whether you're re-drifting off to sleep or just love a good story from the shadows of history, we're glad you're here. Until next time, stay curious, and take care.